Sometimes the people we fear most are the ones who hold our salvation. In the darkest storms, unexpected angels appear in the most unlikely forms. A pregnant woman stumbles through a fierce Norwegian storm toward the one door everyone else avoids. Jorund the Mountain is a giant of a man who lives alone in the forest, feared by all who know his name. But when she collapses at his threshold, gasping, "My baby is coming, please help," everything changes. The nearest village is hours away. No help is coming through the flooded roads. This feared warrior must deliver a baby with only firelight and his own hands to guide him. As lightning splits the sky and contractions grip the woman, two strangers face the storm together. What happens when the woman discovers why this gentle giant lives in exile? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The longhouse stood like a brooding giant among the towering pines, its weathered timber walls blackened by decades of harsh Norwegian winters. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the vast wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. This was Jorund's realm, a place where civilization ended and something older, more primal began. Inside, the massive Viking moved with surprising grace for his size. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Jorund Eriksson had earned his nickname honestly. His hands, scarred from countless battles and years of solitary woodwork, carefully tended the fire that had burned continuously for 20 winters. These same hands that had once wielded a war axe now carved delicate wooden figurines by lamplight, each one a silent prayer to gods who no longer seemed to listen. The thunderstone sat on the mantelpiece above the hearth, its surface worn smooth by countless caresses. The runes carved deep into its granite face were barely visible now, their ancient meanings known only to him and the woman who had etched them there so long ago. Astrid had pressed it into his palm the morning she died, whispering words he still heard in every storm. "When the thunder calls, remember that love endures even when hearts break." 20 years had passed since that bitter winter morning when fever took his beloved wife and their unborn child. 20 years of self-imposed exile in these woods, where the only sounds were wind through pine branches and the distant howl of wolves. The villagers in Bjornstad, 12 miles through treacherous mountain paths, spoke of him in hushed tones. Some called him cursed. Others whispered that grief had driven him mad. All kept their distance. Jorund preferred it that way. The world had taken everything that mattered to him, and in return he had retreated from the world. His longhouse was fortress and prison both, filled with memories that refused to fade and skills he no longer needed. The great hall, where he had once entertained fellow warriors, now echoed with solitude. The cradle he had carved with such hope sat empty in the back room, gathering dust like his dreams. The storm had been building since dawn, starting as a whisper of wind that made the pine needles dance. By midday, the sky had darkened to the color of old iron, pregnant with the kind of rage that reminded men how small they truly were. Jorund had seen such storms before. They came from the north, carrying the fury of distant seas and forgotten battles. Tonight, it would unleash everything it had gathered. He stood at his single window, watching lightning paint the forest in stark white relief. Each flash illuminated the twisted paths that wound between the trees, trails known only to deer and wolves and the occasional lost traveler who stumbled into his domain by accident. Most turned back when they saw the size of him. The few who stayed rarely had good reasons. The wind picked up, sending pine cones rattling against his roof like the fingers of restless spirits. Jorund turned back to his evening ritual, checking the iron locks on his door and shuttering the windows against the coming deluge. Everything in its place, everything secure. This was how he had survived 2 decades of isolation. Through routine, through careful preparation, through the methodical elimination of surprises. But as he reached for the leather cord that would bar the door for the night, something made him pause. A sound beneath the wind's howl, too rhythmic to be natural, too desperate to ignore. Footsteps, stumbling, irregular, but definitely human. Coming closer, Jorund's hand moved instinctively to the war axe mounted beside the door, its blade still sharp despite years of disuse. Visitors after dark never brought good news. Bandits sometimes tried to use the storm as cover, thinking an old hermit would be easy prey. They learned quickly that the mountain's reputation was well earned. The footsteps drew nearer, accompanied now by labored breathing and what sounded like sobbing. Jorund frowned, his warrior's instincts warring with something deeper, something he had buried beneath years of solitude. The sound was wrong for a threat. Too vulnerable, too afraid. A body struck his door with a dull thump, followed by the scrape of fingernails against wood. Then came the voice. A woman's voice, barely audible above the storm's fury, but carrying words that stopped his blood cold. "Please, someone, anyone." Jorund's massive frame went rigid. He had not heard a woman's voice at his door since Astrid drew her final breath. The sound awakened memories he had spent decades trying to silence, ghosts he thought he had finally learned to live with. Another thump against the door, weaker this time. The woman was falling, her strength giving out. Through the thick wood, he could hear her gasping, struggling against something far worse than the storm outside. His hand tightened on the axe handle, but not from aggression. This was the grip of a man confronting the one thing he feared most, hope. For 20 years, he had chosen safety over connection, solitude over the risk of loss. The world beyond his threshold held only pain and disappointment. Better to stay locked away, insulated from the cruelties that fate delighted in dispensing. But the woman's voice came again, weaker now, edged with a desperation that cut through his defenses like a blade through silk. "My baby, please help me." The thunderstone seemed to pulse with warmth from its place on the mantle. The wind screamed through the pines like the voices of the gods themselves, demanding an answer to a question Jorund thought he had settled long ago. Some battles, it seemed, could not be avoided forever. Some moments chose the man, rather than the other way around. The woman's breathing grew more labored outside his door, punctuated by sounds that made his blood run cold with recognition. He had heard those same desperate gasps 20 years ago, in this very room, as Astrid fought a battle she could not win. Jorund's reflection stared back at him from the polished blade of his axe, grey-bearded now, lined with years of solitude, but still recognizable as the man who had once sworn sacred oaths to protect the innocent. That man had failed when it mattered most. But tonight, in the howling darkness of a storm that felt like the end of the world, he faced a chance at redemption he never expected to receive. The choice was his to make. Safety or service, solitude or salvation. The woman's cry of pain decided it for him. Jorund's hand trembled as he reached for the iron bar that secured his door. 20 years of carefully constructed isolation hung in the balance, 20 years of protection from the world's capacity for heartbreak. But the woman's anguished cry cut through his defenses like a blade through parchment, awakening something he thought had died with Astrid. The bar lifted with a grinding screech of metal against metal. Cold wind burst through the opening, carrying with it the scent of rain and pine, and something else. Blood and fear, and the unmistakable urgency of life fighting to enter the world. Lightning illuminated the scene before him in stark, terrible clarity. She was young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair plastered to her skull by the driving rain. Her woolen cloak, once fine but now soaked and torn, clung to a body swollen with advanced pregnancy. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, green as spring leaves, wide with pain and terror, yet burning with a fierce determination that reminded him achingly of another woman who had faced impossible odds with courage. "Please," she gasped. One hand clutched to her enormous belly, the other braced against his doorframe. "I can't. The baby's coming now." Jorund stood frozen in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the entrance like a mountain itself. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to close the door, to retreat into the safety of his solitude. This was how it had started with Astrid. First the excitement, then the complications. then the long spiral into loss and devastation that had nearly destroyed him. But as another contraction seized the woman, doubling her over with a cry that tore at his heart, 20 years of carefully maintained distance crumbled in an instant. "Inside," he rumbled, his voice rusty from disuse. Quickly, he swept her up in his arms as easily as he might lift a child, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to the great hearth, where firelight danced across ancient tapestries depicting battles and celebrations from a life he no longer lived. "What's your name?" he asked, settling her as gently as his great hands would allow onto the pile of furs before the fire. "Ingrid," she panted, her face pale as birch bark. "Ingrid Magnusdottir. From Stavanger." Another wave of pain hit her, and she gripped his arm with surprising strength. "How far to the nearest midwife?" Jorund's jaw tightened. 12 miles to Bjornstad, through mountain paths that are flooded now. No one can travel these roads until the storm passes. He glanced at the shuttered window, where rain hammered against wood with increasing fury. That won't be until dawn at earliest. The reality settled between them like a stone dropping into dark water. They were alone. A reclusive giant who had avoided human contact for 2 decades, and a woman about to give birth in the wilderness, with nothing but firelight and whatever knowledge they could piece together between them. "Have you ever," Ingrid began, then bit back the question as another contraction gripped her, "delivered a baby?" Jorund's scarred hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I was present when—" He stopped, the old wound tearing open fresh. "My wife, 20 years ago. But He couldn't finish, couldn't voice the words that still haunted his dreams. How do you tell a laboring woman that the last birth you witnessed ended in death? How do you offer hope when your own experience was written in graves? Ingrid seemed to understand without explanation. Through her pain, she reached out and touched his hand. The first human contact he'd experienced in years that wasn't born of fear or necessity. What was her name? She asked, softly. Astrid. The name felt strange on his tongue, like a prayer in a forgotten language. She would want you to help me, Ingrid said with quiet certainty. A mother knows these things. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the longhouse in harsh white light. Thunder followed immediately, so close that the building shook on its foundations. The storm was directly overhead now, trapping them in their own small world of firelight and approaching birth. Jorund moved with sudden purpose, the paralysis of doubt giving way to action. He had lived as a hermit for 20 years, but before that he had been a warrior, a leader of men, someone who faced impossible odds and found ways to survive. Those skills had not disappeared, only hidden beneath layers of grief and self-imposed exile. "We need clean water," he said, already moving toward the kitchen area. "Soft cloths. Something to cut the cord." His mind raced through half-remembered conversations with the village women, fragments of knowledge he'd absorbed without realizing during his younger years. As he gathered supplies, Ingrid's breathing grew more labored. The contractions were coming faster now, each one announced by a sharp intake of breath that cut through the storm's noise like a blade. This baby would not wait for dawn or midwives or anything else the world might prefer. "Tell me about your husband," Jorund said as he returned with an armload of supplies, hoping conversation might distract her from the pain. "Is he looking for you?" Ingrid's face darkened. "Dead," she said simply. 3 months passed. Fever took him and most of our village. She struggled to sit up straighter. "I was traveling to my sister in Bergen when the storm caught me. The cart overturned in the mud, and the horse bolted. I walked for hours before I saw your light, so she was alone in the world, just as he was." The parallel struck him with unexpected force. Here was another soul cast adrift by circumstance, seeking shelter from a storm that was both literal and metaphorical. Perhaps that was why fate had brought her to his door, 2 broken people finding each other in the darkness. "You're safe now," he heard himself saying, words he hadn't spoken in 20 years. "I won't let anything happen to you or your child." The promise hung in the air between them, as binding as any oath sworn before altar or battlefield. Ingrid's eyes met his, and in them he saw not just pain and fear, but trust, the kind of absolute faith that he'd thought no longer existed in the world. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the others, and she cried out despite her efforts to remain strong. The sound awakened something primal in Jorund's chest, some ancient instinct that transcended his fear and doubt. This woman had placed her life and her child's life in his hands. Everything else, his grief, his isolation, his carefully constructed walls, became secondary to that sacred trust. The storm raged outside, but within the circle of firelight, something older and more powerful was stirring. Life itself, demanding entrance into a world that had shown both of them more than their share of sorrow. The baby would come tonight, ready or not, and Jorund realized that after 20 years of running from responsibility and connection, he was exactly where he needed to be. The Thunderstone caught the firelight from its place on the mantle, its ancient runes seeming to pulse with otherworldly energy. Astrid's voice whispered in his memory, as clear as if she stood beside him. When the thunder calls, remember that love endures even when hearts break. Tonight, he would discover whether that was true. The hours that followed tested every skill Jorund had accumulated in his 63 years of life. He moved through his longhouse like a man possessed, gathering supplies with the methodical precision that had once made him legendary among his warrior brothers. Clean linen strips torn from his finest shirts, a sharp knife heated in the fire until it glowed, water boiled in his largest iron pot, steam rising like prayers into the shadowed rafters. Ingrid watched him work through waves of increasingly intense contractions, her green eyes following his massive form as he prepared for the battle ahead. There was something deeply reassuring about his movements. No wasted motion, no panic, just the steady competence of a man who had faced impossible odds before and survived. "You move like a warrior preparing for a battle," she observed during a brief respite between pains. Jorund paused in his preparation, a bundle of clean cloth in his scarred hands. "Birth is a kind of battle," he said quietly. "Life fighting its way into the world against all the forces that would stop it." He glanced toward the thunderstone on the mantle. "My wife used to say that every mother is a warrior. Whether she knows it or not, the wind outside had reached a howling crescendo, driving rain against the shuttered windows with such force that the whole longhouse seemed to shudder. But within the circle of firelight, a different kind of storm was building. Ingrid's contractions were coming faster now, each one stronger than the last, her body preparing for the ancient dance between mother and child that had played out countless times since the world began. Jorund knelt beside her, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her find a more comfortable position. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. He had not touched another human being with tenderness in 20 years, had forgotten the simple power of connection between souls facing uncertainty together. "Talk to me," Ingrid gasped, as another wave of pain crested. "Now tell me about this place. How long have you lived here?" He understood her need for distraction, for something to anchor her mind while her body did its work. 22 years, he said, his voice taking on the cadence of an old storyteller. "I built it with my own hands after I lost my family. Every beam and board, every stone in the foundation. It was going to be our home, Astrid's and mine. Our children would have grown up here, played in these very rooms." His voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. Speaking of Astrid no longer felt like tearing open old wounds, more like sharing precious memories with someone who understood loss. She loved this spot because you can see the whole valley from the front door. "Like being perched on the edge of the world," she used to say. "In spring, when the snow melts, wildflowers carpet the meadow in every color you can imagine." Astrid said it looked like the gods had spilled their paint across the earth. Ingrid smiled, despite her pain. "She sounds like a poet." "She was many things," Jorund replied, his hands busy arranging the birthing supplies. "Healer, storyteller, the best archer in 3 villages. She could bring down a running deer at 100 paces, then weep over a wounded bird." He shook his head at the contradiction that had been his beloved wife. She would have delivered 12 babies in the time it's taking me to prepare for one. A particularly strong contraction seized Ingrid, and she gripped Jorund's arm with both hands, her fingernails digging into his weathered skin. He felt her strength, her determination, and something else, the same fierce protectiveness he remembered from Astrid. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. How far apart are they now? He asked, though he already knew the answer from watching her closely. Close, she panted. Very close. I think it's almost time. Jorund nodded, his own heart racing despite his outward calm. The theoretical knowledge he'd gathered from village women and half-remembered conversations would soon meet the brutal reality of birth. All his preparation, all his careful arrangements, came down to this moment when life demanded entry into the world, whether he was ready or not. He positioned himself where Astrid's midwife had knelt 20 years ago, his hands steady despite the trembling in his chest. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had fled from life's complexities was about to help usher new life into existence. Perhaps this was fate's way of forcing him to confront the very thing he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. I need you to listen to me, he said, his voice taking on the authority he'd once used to command warriors in battle. When the next contraction comes, I need you to push with everything you have. Can you do that? Ingrid nodded, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. I can do anything if it means my baby lives. The simple statement hung between them like a vow. Here was a woman who had lost her husband, her home, her entire world, and still fought with every breath to protect the life growing inside her. Jorund felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built to protect himself from caring too much. This wasn't just about delivering a baby anymore. This was about proving that hope could survive even the darkest storms. Lightning split the sky outside, followed immediately by thunder so close it seemed to shake the earth itself. The storm was reaching its peak, and with it the moment of truth approached. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the tools and knowledge gleaned from a lifetime of survival, Jorund prepared to face the greatest challenge of his long exile. The next contraction built like a wave-gathering force, and Ingrid's eyes met his with absolute trust. In that gaze, he saw not just a woman in labor, but every mother who had ever faced this moment, including his beloved Astrid. The weight of their shared faith settled on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Now, he said quietly, his hands moving to their positions. We'll push now. And in that moment, 20 years of isolation fell away like snow before the spring sun. Whatever happened next, he would not face it alone. The longhouse filled with sounds that hadn't echoed within its walls for 20 years, the primal cries of a woman bringing life into the world, the urgent whispers of encouragement, the crackle of the fire that provided their only light against the storm's darkness. Jorund found himself falling into rhythms older than memory, his body and mind responding to instincts he'd thought were buried forever. I can see the head, he said, his voice tight with wonder and fear. Dark hair just like yours. Ingrid's laugh was more sob than mirth. My husband, he had dark hair too. She bore down with the next contraction, her whole being focused on the monumental task before her. Tell me what you see. Jorund's massive hands trembled as he supported the emerging life. 20 years ago, in this very room, he'd watched Astrid fight this same battle and lose. The memory threatened to overwhelm him, but Ingrid's determined grunts pulled him back to the present. This was not then. This woman was not Astrid. This child would live. Perfect, he murmured, meaning it. Everything looks perfect. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very gods were holding their breath. In that moment of supernatural stillness, the baby's head emerged fully into Jorund's waiting hands. The sight struck him like a physical blow, so small, so fragile, yet already fighting to draw breath in this harsh world. One more push, he said, his voice stronger now. Your child is almost here. Ingrid gathered herself for one final effort, drawing strength from reserves she didn't know she possessed. Her cry filled the longhouse, echoing off rafters that had heard only solitude for decades. And then, in a rush of fluid and relief and pure, blazing life, the baby slipped free into Jorund's gentle hands. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the child lay silent and still. Jorund's heart stopped, remembering another baby who had never drawn breath, never cried, never. The infant's wail shattered the silence like breaking glass, strong and angry and absolutely wonderfully alive. The sound hit Jorund with the force of revelation, washing away 20 years of grief in an instant. This child lived. This child breathed. This child demanded recognition from a world that had already tried to take so much. A girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have a daughter. Ingrid fell back against the furs, tears streaming down her face. Is she whole? Healthy? Jorund examined the squalling infant with hands that had grown surprisingly steady. 10 perfect fingers, 10 tiny toes, eyes screwed shut against the firelight but clearly functional. The baby's cries were strong and indignant, her small fists waving as if already preparing to fight whatever challenges awaited her. She's beautiful, he said simply. Strong as a young bear and twice as loud, he cleaned the infant with gentle efficiency, his movements guided by half-remembered instructions and pure instinct. The baby quieted slightly at his touch, as if recognizing something trustworthy in his scarred hands. When she was clean and warm, wrapped in the softest cloth he owned, he placed her on Ingrid's chest. The moment mother and daughter touched, something shifted in the longhouse's very atmosphere. The ancient walls, which had witnessed only loneliness for so long, seemed to sigh with contentment. This was what the space had been built for. Not isolation, but connection. Not an ending, but a beginning. What will you call her? Jorund asked, carefully cutting and tying the cord that had connected mother and child. Ingrid gazed down at her daughter with eyes full of wonder. I thought if she was a girl, Astrid, after my grandmother. But now, she looked up at Jorund, her expression thoughtful. Now I think she should be Astrid for another reason entirely. Jorund's breath caught. The name hung in the air between them, carrying 20 years of grief and love and loss. To hear it spoken over a living child, in this room where his own Astrid had died, it felt like benediction and resurrection combined. Your wife would be honored, Ingrid said softly. And so am I to name my daughter for a woman who raised such a good man. The baby, Astrid, made a small sound of contentment. Her tiny fingers curled around a strand of her mother's auburn hair. In the firelight she looked ancient and wise, as if she understood the significance of the name she would carry into the world. Jorund busied himself with cleaning up, giving himself time to process the overwhelming emotions coursing through him. His hands shook as he gathered the soiled cloths, his mind struggling to reconcile the joy of new life with the pain of old losses. The thunderstone caught his eye from its place on the mantel, and he could almost hear his beloved wife's voice whispering approval across the years. You saved us, Ingrid said, watching him work. Both of us. We would have died out there in the storm. You saved yourself, Jorund replied. I just provided shelter. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Something had shifted inside him during the night, some fundamental change that went deeper than the simple act of delivering a baby. For 20 years, he had lived as a ghost haunting his own existence. Tonight, helping bring new life into the world, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was dead forever. Hope. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the wind's howl fading to a gentle murmur. Dawn was still hours away, but Jorund could sense the darkness loosening its grip on the world. Soon, morning would come, bringing with it questions and decisions he wasn't prepared to face. What would happen to this woman and child? Where would they go? How could he return to his isolation after witnessing such a miracle? But those concerns belonged to tomorrow. Tonight, in the warm glow of firelight, with a newborn's gentle breathing and her mother's contented sighs filling the ancient silence, Jorund allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. The baby stirred in her mother's arms, and Ingrid began to hum, a lullaby as old as the fjords themselves, passed down through generations of mothers to comfort their children against the dark. The melody filled the longhouse with warmth more profound than any fire could provide, and for the first time in 20 years, Jorund the Mountain smiled. Dawn crept through the shuttered windows like a cautious visitor, painting thin lines of gold across the longhouse floor. The storm had finally exhausted itself some time before sunrise, leaving behind the kind of pristine silence that follows great upheavals. Jorund sat beside the dying fire, watching mother and child sleep in the nest of furs he'd arranged for them, marveling at how completely the presence of two strangers had transformed his carefully ordered world. Little Astrid lay curled against her mother's chest, a tiny fist pressed against her cheek, breathing with the deep contentment of the newly born. In sleep, Ingrid looked younger than her years, the worry lines that had etched themselves around her eyes smoothed away by exhaustion and relief. They were both alive, both healthy, a miracle that still seemed too fragile to fully trust. Jorund rose quietly, his joints protesting after the long night's vigil, and moved to unshutter the windows. The world outside had been washed clean by the storm. Pine boughs drooped under the weight of gathered rainwater, and the air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. The violence of the previous night seemed impossible now, as if it had been nothing more than a particularly vivid dream, but the evidence of its reality lay sleeping before his. Hearth, two lives that had been delivered into his care by forces beyond his understanding or control. The question that had haunted his pre-dawn hours remained, what happened now? How beautiful, came Ingrid's voice from behind him. She had awakened silently, the baby still nestled against her. I can see why your wife loved this place. Jorund turned, struck again by how naturally she seemed to fit into his space. The valley changes with the seasons, he said. In spring it's green as far as the eye can see. Summer brings wildflowers that paint the meadows like a tapestry. Even winter has its own harsh beauty. You speak of it like a poet, Ingrid observed, shifting the baby to a more comfortable position. Not what I expected from the mountain. The nickname hung between them, carrying with it all the stories and whispers that had built his fearsome reputation. Jorund moved to the cold hearth, beginning the morning ritual of rebuilding the fire. People prefer their legends simple, he said. A giant who lives alone in the woods, feared by all who know his name. It's easier than the truth, which is... He paused in his work, a piece of kindling halfway to the growing flames. That I'm just a man who loved someone more than life itself and couldn't bear the world without her. The baby stirred at the sound of their voices, making small sounds of awakening. Ingrid looked down at her daughter with the expression of wonder that Jorund remembered from his own brief experience of impending fatherhood. Part joy, part terror, all-consuming love mixed with the weight of absolute responsibility. She's hungry, Ingrid said, beginning to unlace her dress. Could you give us a moment? Jorund nodded and stepped outside, giving them privacy while he assessed the storm's damage. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. His small garden had been battered but not destroyed. The path to the village would be muddy, but passable by afternoon. Normal life could resume, which raised the question that had been gnawing at him since the first moment he'd opened his door. What was normal now? For 20 years, his routine had been as fixed as the sunrise. Wake with the dawn, tend the fire, work in his garden or workshop, eat simple meals in solitude, sleep when darkness fell. Day after day, season after season, year after year, a life reduced to its most essential elements, stripped of complexity and surprise. But as he stood in his doorway, listening to Ingrid's soft murmurs to her daughter, he realized that the old routine felt as distant as his warrior days. Something fundamental had shifted in the night, some internal structure that had governed his existence for 2 decades. The careful walls he'd built around his heart showed cracks that let in more than light. They let in possibility. When he returned inside, Ingrid was sitting up properly, the baby contentedly nursing. She looked more alert now, her green eyes taking in details of the longhouse that the crisis of birth had obscured. He saw her gaze linger on the carved wooden figurines that lined his shelves, the tapestries that depicted scenes from a more social past, the empty cradle in the corner that had gathered dust for 20 years. "You were going to be a father," she said quietly. "For a brief time." "Yes." Jorund settled into his chair, maintaining a respectful distance. "Astrid was 6 months along when the fever came. It took them both. I'm sorry." The words carried genuine grief, not just polite sympathy. "To lose so much at once, it broke something in me," he admitted. "I thought it was permanent. But last night," he gestured helplessly, lacking words for the transformation he'd experienced. "Last night, you delivered my daughter and probably saved both our lives." "That's not the action of a broken man." The baby finished nursing and began to fuss, tiny features screwing up in preparation for a cry. Without thinking, Jorund extended his arms. "May I?" Ingrid hesitated for only a moment before placing the infant in his massive hands. Little Astrid looked impossibly small against his broad chest, her dark hair still damp and curling. She gazed up at him with the unfocused attention of the newborn, and he felt something settle into place in his chest, some missing piece clicking home after years of absence. "She likes you," Ingrid observed with a smile. "She doesn't know any better yet." But Jorund's voice was gentle as he cradled the child, his scarred fingers tracing the perfect curve of her cheek. "Babies trust everyone at first. It's only later they learn to be afraid. Perhaps they're wiser than we give them credit for. Perhaps they see things we've forgotten how to notice." The observation struck him with unexpected force. When had he last looked at another person without the filter of suspicion and self-protection? When had he last opened himself to the possibility of connection without calculating the potential cost? A sound from outside interrupted his thoughts, the distant whinny of a horse, followed by voices calling through the morning air. Jorund tensed, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Visitors were rare at any time, unheard of after a night like the one they'd endured. "Stay quiet," he murmured, handing the baby back to Ingrid and moving toward the window. Through the gaps in the shutters, he could see 3 mounted figures picking their way carefully up the muddy path that led to his longhouse. They wore the rough clothes of farmers or tradesmen, but there was something purposeful in their approach that set his teeth on edge. "Jorund the Mountain," one of them called. "We know you're in there. We've come from Stavanger looking for a woman." The color drained from Ingrid's face as the voices echoed across the valley. She clutched little Astrid closer to her chest, her eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than simple surprise. Jorund recognized that look. He had seen it in the faces of hunted animals, in the eyes of warriors who knew they were outnumbered and cornered. "Do you know them?" he asked quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the war axe mounted beside the door. "My husband's brothers," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hoped they'd given up the search." "Search for what?" But before she could answer, the lead rider called out again, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We tracked her this far before the storm hit. Her cart was found overturned 3 miles south. If she sought shelter here, we've come to collect what's ours." Jorund's blood turned to ice water. The casual way the man spoke of collecting, Ingrid told him everything he needed to know about these visitors' intentions. His massive frame filled the doorway as he stepped outside, deliberately blocking their view into the longhouse interior. The 3 men sat their horses in a rough line across his yard, their faces hard with the kind of determination that came from pursuing something valuable. The leader was a bull-necked man in his 40s, with pale eyes and a beard that couldn't quite hide the cruel set of his mouth. His companions were younger, but cut from the same harsh cloth, men who had learned to take what they wanted and worry about consequences later. "I am Magnus Eriksson," the leader announced, as if his name should carry weight in these remote mountains. "We seek Ingrid Magnusdottir, widow of my brother Olaf. She fled Stavanger with property that belongs to our family." "I've seen no woman," Jorund replied evenly. The storm was fierce. Anyone caught in it would be lucky to survive. Magnus's eyes narrowed, studying Jorund's face for signs of deception. "You're a large man, Mountain. Large enough to hide someone, if you were of a mind to." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jorund felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the battle calm that had served him well in his warrior days. These men had ridden hard to find Ingrid, which meant whatever they wanted from her was valuable enough to risk the dangerous mountain paths after a storm. "What manner of property?" Jorund asked, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. "Gold," said one of the younger men, earning a sharp look from Magnus. "Our brother's inheritance, which rightfully passes to his blood family. Not some foreign woman he married. The inheritance is mine by law." Ingrid's voice came from just inside the doorway, steady despite the fear Jorund could hear beneath her words. "Witnessed and sealed by the magistrate in Stavanger." Magnus's face split in a cold smile as Ingrid stepped into view, the baby still cradled in her arms. "Ah, there you are, sister-in-law. You've led us quite a chase. What I carry is not yours to claim," she said, lifting her chin with defiance that reminded Jorund achingly of his beloved Astrid. "Olaf made his wishes clear before he died." Olaf was fevered and not thinking clearly. "What business does a foreign woman have with gold that's been in our family for 3 generations? Magnus's voice hardened. "You'll return what you've taken, and we'll say no more about this unfortunate misunderstanding." Jorund stepped closer to Ingrid, his massive frame casting a protective shadow. The movement was subtle, but all 3 men noticed, their hands shifting closer to the weapons at their sides. "The woman has given birth this night," Jorund said quietly. "She needs rest, not travel." "Given birth?" Magnus's pale eyes fixed on the bundle in Ingrid's arms with sudden interest. "To Olaf's child." The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Jorund saw Ingrid's jaw tighten, saw her arms instinctively tighten around her daughter. Whatever game these men were playing, the stakes had just risen considerably. "My daughter was born in this house," Ingrid said carefully. "She is no concern of yours." "On the contrary," Magnus said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "If the child is Olaf's heir, then she represents a claim on the family inheritance. We can't simply ignore such a complication." The 2 younger men followed their leader's example, spreading out slightly as they approached. Jorund noted their positions, the way they moved with practiced coordination. These weren't simple farmers. They were men who had worked together before, who knew how to corner prey and cut off escape routes. "The child was born too soon," Ingrid said quickly. She could not be Olaf's, but Magnus was close enough now to see the baby clearly, to note the dark hair and strong features that marked her as more than premature. His smile turned genuinely unpleasant. "She looks quite healthy for an early birth, and quite substantial." "I think our brother's legacy is more complicated than we anticipated." Jorund's hand closed around the axe handle, his warrior instincts screaming warnings. 3 against 1, with Ingrid and the baby to protect. Poor odds under any circumstances, worse when he hadn't lifted a weapon in anger for 20 years. But as he watched Magnus reach toward the baby, something ancient and implacable awakened in his chest. These men had traveled far to claim what wasn't theirs, to threaten a woman who had already lost everything, to endanger a child who had drawn her first breath in his care. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice carrying the authority of glaciers and mountain storms. Magnus paused, his hands still extended, studying Jorund's face. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider his approach. "We're not unreasonable men, Mountain. The woman can keep the child. We're not monsters. But the gold comes with us. Surely you can see the justice in that?" "I see 3 men threatening a new mother on my property," Jorund replied. "That's all I need to see." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each side measuring the other's resolve. In his arms, little Astrid began to fuss, sensing the tension that crackled through the morning air. The sound seemed to break something in Magnus's patience. "We'll take what we came for," he said, his hand dropping to his sword hilt. "With or without your cooperation." The thunderstone seemed to pulse with warmth from its place inside the longhouse. And Jorund heard his wife's voice across the years. Some battles choose the warrior, rather than the other way around. This was one of those battles. The morning air grew thick with tension as Magnus's hand tightened on his sword hilt. But before violence could erupt, Ingrid stepped forward, placing herself between the armed men and the longhouse doorway. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a strange mixture of resignation and steel. "There's something you need to know before we go any further." Magnus paused, his pale eyes narrowing. "What game are you playing now, woman?" "No game." Ingrid's gaze moved to Jorund, and in her green eyes he saw an apology for what was about to come. "The truth is more complicated than any of us realized." She reached beneath her travel cloak and withdrew a leather pouch, heavy with the weight of more than coins. The gold within clinked softly as she held it up. But her attention was focused on something else, a folded piece of parchment she extracted from the pouch's inner pocket. "This is what you really came for, isn't it?" she said to Magnus. "Not just the gold, but what the gold represents." Magnus's face had gone very still. "I don't know what you mean." "The seal of King Harald himself. The official recognition of legitimacy. The document that makes little Astrid not just Olaf's daughter, but his legal heir to lands that stretch from Stavanger to the northern fjords." Jorund felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The woman he had sheltered, the child he had delivered, carried bloodlines that reached far beyond a simple farmer's inheritance. The baby sleeping in Ingrid's arms was not just a new life brought into the world. She was a claimant to one of the richest holdings in western Norway. "Impossible," breathed one of the younger men. "Olaf was a second son. He inherited nothing." "Olaf was indeed a second son," Ingrid agreed. "But his older brother Eric died in the last Danish raids with no male heirs. The lands passed to Olaf by right of blood, though he never lived to claim them. They pass now to his daughter." Magnus's face had gone white as winter snow. "You're lying. Eric had sons. Eric had sons who died with him." Ingrid's voice was steady as stone. "I have the documents to prove it, sealed by witnesses and blessed by the church. Everything you thought you knew about your family's legacy is wrong." The leather pouch seemed to grow heavier in her hands as the full implications settled over the assembled men. This was not a simple matter of a widow's inheritance anymore. This was a question of who would control vast stretches of fertile land, strategic harbors, trade routes that had been fought over for generations. "Why didn't Olaf tell us?" Magnus demanded, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Because he was dying when the news came. Because he knew what you would do with the knowledge." Ingrid shifted the baby to one arm, keeping the documents well out of reach. "Because he wanted his daughter to grow up safe, not as a pawn in games of power and greed." Jorund's mind raced through the implications. No wonder these men had pursued Ingrid through a deadly storm. No wonder she had fled Stavanger in secret, traveling the dangerous mountain roads alone. The child he had helped bring into the world was not just any baby. She was potentially one of the wealthiest landowners in Norway. "This changes nothing," Magnus said. But his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "The child is still family. We'll see that she's raised properly, given the education and protection her station requires." "Under your guardianship, you mean?" Ingrid's laugh held no humor. "With you controlling her inheritance until she comes of age. How convenient. We're her bloodkin. Who else would?" "I would." The words fell from Jorund's lips before he'd fully formed the thought. Every eye turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But as he looked at little Astrid, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, he knew the truth of what he'd said with absolute certainty. "I beg your pardon?" Magnus's voice dripped with disbelief. "The child was born in my house, delivered by my hands. By the old laws, that makes her as much my responsibility as anyone's." Jorund stepped closer to Ingrid, his massive frame casting a protective shadow over mother and child. "I claim the right of fosterage. You're not family," one of the younger men protested. "You have no legal standing, don't I?" Jorund's voice took on the authority he'd once used to command warriors in battle. I am Jorund Eriksson, son of Eric Ironhand, grandson of Magnus the Bold. My bloodline reaches back to the first kings of these mountains. I may live as a hermit, but my birth gives me the right to speak for this child's welfare. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Magnus took an involuntary step backward, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and calculation. Even in his exile, Jorund's family name carried weight, especially when it came to matters of fosterage and protection. Eriksson, Magnus breathed. I should have seen the resemblance. Your grandfather's reputation reached even to Stavanger, as does mine, I'm told. The question is whether you're foolish enough to test it. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 3 armed men against 1 giant who hadn't lifted a weapon in 20 years, but whose name alone gave them pause. The mathematics of violence suddenly seemed less certain, but it was Ingrid who broke the tension. Her voice cutting through the morning air with quiet authority. There's one more thing you should know, she said, and something in her tone made every man present go still. The documents I carry aren't just proof of inheritance. They're also a royal decree, issued on King Harald's personal seal. She unfolded the parchment with careful precision, revealing elaborate script and official seals that even from a distance carried the weight of ultimate authority. A decree stating that young Astrid Olafsdottir is under the direct protection of the crown until she reaches her majority. Anyone who attempts to harm her, coerce her, or unlawfully claim her inheritance will answer to the king himself. The words fell like stones into still water, their implications rippling outward in waves. This was no longer a family dispute over gold and land. This was a matter that reached all the way to the royal court. To move against the child now would be treason. Magnus stared at the document as if it might bite him, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Why would the king take such interest in one child? Ingrid's smile was small and sad. Because Olaf was more than just a landowner. He was the king's cousin, though few knew it. The blood that runs in my daughter's veins is royal blood. In the silence that followed, little Astrid stirred in her mother's arms and opened her eyes, dark eyes, that seemed to look directly at each man present with the ancient wisdom of kings and the innocent. Trust of the newborn. The game had changed completely. The question now was what each man would choose to do about it. The revelation of royal blood changed the very air around the longhouse, charging it with the kind of dangerous energy that precedes momentous decisions. Magnus stared at the parchment in Ingrid's hands as if it were a coiled viper, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he'd just learned. Royal blood, he murmured, his voice barely audible. That's impossible. Olaf never said. Olaf kept many secrets, Ingrid replied, carefully refolding the document and tucking it back into her pouch. He believed that knowledge was dangerous, that it painted targets on the backs of those he loved. He was right. Jorund watched the 3 men carefully, noting how their postures had shifted since the revelation. The younger 2 looked uncertain, glancing between their leader and the child, as if seeing her for the first time. But Magnus was calculating, his pale eyes moving between Ingrid, the baby, and the legal document that changed everything. Even if what you say is true, Magnus said slowly, the child is still an infant. Someone must serve as her guardian, manage her inheritance, make decisions on her behalf. The king's protection doesn't eliminate the need for family guidance. No, Jorund said quietly, his massive frame shifting slightly to better shield Ingrid and the baby. But it does mean that any guardianship would be subject to royal oversight. No one could simply claim what belongs to her. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Magnus's hand had drifted back toward his sword hilt, but now he seemed to realize that drawing steel against a child under royal protection would be tantamount to signing his own death warrant. You speak as if you have some claim yourself. Mountain, Magnus said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. But fosterage rights or not, you're still just a hermit living in the woods. What could you offer this child that we could not? It was a fair question and one that struck at the heart of Jorund's own doubts. What did he have to offer? A life of isolation? 20 years of running from the world's complexities, a long house filled with memories of loss and grief. But as he looked down at little Astrid, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with duty or law or ancient rights. This child had been born in his home, delivered by his hands, given a name that honored his beloved wife. In the space of one night, she had already changed him more than 20 years of solitude had managed to do. "I can offer her something you cannot," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I can offer her a life free from the hunger for power that drives men like you, a place to grow up safely, away from the politics and scheming that killed her father. Safety?" Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Safety in a hermit's hovel miles from civilization? What happens when she comes of age and discovers the inheritance you've kept from her? What happens when the king demands an accounting of how his royal cousin was raised? The questions cut deep, because they touched on fears Jorund had been trying not to examine too closely. What did he know about raising a child, especially one whose destiny reached far beyond these mountain valleys? What right did he have to make such a choice on her behalf? "The king's decree was clear," Ingrid interjected, her voice steady, despite the tremor Jorund could hear beneath her words. "Astrid is to be protected until she reaches her majority. Not controlled, not used, not bargained with, protected. And who better to provide that protection than her own family?" Magnus countered, "We have resources, connections, the ability to prepare her for the responsibilities she'll inherit." "You have greed," Jorund said flatly, "and the kind of ambition that sees children as tools rather than treasures." Magnus's face darkened. "You know nothing of our intentions, Hermit. You judge us based on fear and suspicion. I judge you based on the fact that you tracked a pregnant woman through a deadly storm to claim gold that wasn't yours to take," Jorund replied. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The standoff stretched tighter, 3 armed men facing one giant who stood between them and their quarry. But now the stakes had risen beyond simple greed. This was about the future of a child whose bloodline reached to the throne itself, whose inheritance could reshape the balance of power in western Norway. Little Astrid chose that moment to wake, her dark eyes opening with the unfocused attention of the newborn. She made a small sound of contentment, one tiny fist waving in the morning air, oblivious to the tension that surrounded her. The sight of her innocence seemed to affect all the men present, reminding them that whatever choices they made would echo through her entire life. "There's another way," Ingrid said suddenly, her voice cutting through the dangerous silence. "A solution that honors both the law and the child's best interests." Magnus turned to her, his eyebrows raised. "I'm listening." "Joint guardianship," she said, the words coming faster now as the idea took shape. "Jorund provides the day-to-day care, the safe haven away from political intrigue. You maintain the legal oversight. Ensure her inheritance is properly managed. See that she receives the education her station requires. Shared custody," Magnus mused, his expression thoughtful. "The hermit raises her, but we retain legal authority over major decisions." "No." The word came from Jorund with the force of a mountain avalanche. "I will not have this child's life decided by committee, or see her become a pawn in games of power and influence." "Then what do you propose?" Magnus demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. Jorund looked down at the baby in Ingrid's arms, then at her mother, then at the 3 men who had ridden through storm and danger to claim what they believed was theirs. In that moment, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Trial by combat," he said quietly. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water. All 5 adults stared at him in shock, even Ingrid's eyes widening with disbelief. "What did you say?" Magnus breathed. "You heard me." Jorund straightened to his full, intimidating height, his scarred hands flexing unconsciously. "Trial by combat. The old way. Winner takes guardianship of the child, with all rights and responsibilities that entails." That's barbaric," one of the younger men stammered. "We're civilized people, not savages, are we?" Jorund's gaze moved from man to man, measuring their resolve. You came here armed, prepared to take by force what you couldn't claim by law. How is that more civilized than settling this honestly, with strength and skill? Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying Jorund's massive frame with the calculating gaze of a man weighing odds. You're serious, deadly serious. Single combat, to first blood or yield. The winner's claim is recognized by all present. And if you lose, Magnus asked, if we take the child back to Stavanger, away from your mountain hermitage. Jorund felt something cold settle in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Then I will have honored the old ways, and you will have won her fairly. But if I win, you ride away and never return. The child stays here under my protection until she's old enough to choose her own path. The challenge hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Magnus looked at his companions, seeing doubt in their faces. Fighting the mountain was not a prospect any sane man would relish. But the alternative, leaving empty-handed after traveling so far, was equally unpalatable. Very well, Magnus said at last, his voice carrying the finality of fate itself. Trial by combat it is. But I choose the weapons, Jorund nodded grimly. Name them, war axes, the weapons of our ancestors. A slow smile spread across Jorund's weathered features. So be it. As the two men prepared for battle, Ingrid clutched her daughter closer, whispering prayers to gods both old and new. The child's future would be decided in the next few minutes, shaped by strength and skill and the ancient laws that still governed the hearts of northern men. The storm had passed, but the thunder was just beginning. The clearing in front of Jorund's longhouse transformed into an arena as ancient as the blood that flowed through northern veins. Magnus dismounted and selected his weapon from the gear strapped to his saddle, a well-balanced war axe with a head that gleamed like silver in the morning light. Its handle was worn smooth by years of use, marking its bearer as a man who knew his way around a blade. Jorund retrieved his own axe from its place beside the door, where it had hung unused for 20 years. The weapon felt strange in his hands at first, heavier than he remembered, the balance somehow different. But as his fingers closed around the leather-wrapped handle, muscle memory began to awaken. His shoulders straightened, his stance shifted, and for a moment the years fell away like morning mist. You sure about this, old man? Magnus asked, testing the weight of his axe with practiced swings. It's been a long time since you swung that blade in anger. Longer than you might think, Jorund agreed, his voice calm as deep water. But some things you never forget. Ingrid had retreated to the longhouse doorway, clutching little Astrid against her chest. The baby slept on, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. But her mother's green eyes were wide with fear and something deeper. A recognition that the next few minutes would shape her daughter's entire future. The two younger men positioned themselves as witnesses, their faces grave with the solemnity of the moment. This was not mere violence. This was justice being worked out in the oldest way their people knew, where strength of arm and purity of purpose determined the truth. First blood or yield, Magnus called out, raising his axe in formal salute. The gods witness our cause. The gods witness, Jorund replied, returning the gesture. Then more quietly, forgive me, Astrid. I hope you understand. The words were meant for his long-dead wife, but Ingrid heard them and felt her heart clench with sudden understanding. This man was about to risk everything. His life, his carefully constructed peace, his chance at redemption, for a child he'd known for less than a day. The magnitude of his sacrifice took her breath away. Magnus moved first, circling to Jorund's left with the fluid grace of a man who had fought many battles. His axe wove patterns in the air, probing for openings, testing his opponent's reflexes. But Jorund stood like a mountain himself, massive and unmovable, his dark eyes tracking every motion with predatory patience. You're slower than I expected, Magnus taunted, his blade whistling through the air in a series of practice swings. 20 years of soft living has made you weak, hermit. Jorund said nothing, but his grip on the axe handle tightened imperceptibly. He could feel rust in his movements, hesitation where there had once been flowing certainty. His body remembered the forms, but it had been too long since they'd been put to practical use. Magnus struck without warning, his axe sweeping in a vicious arc toward Jorund's ribs. The mountain man twisted aside, bringing his own weapon up in a defensive parry that sent sparks flying as steel met steel. The impact jarred his arms, reminding him how much strength he'd lost to years of peaceful solitude. Better, Magnus grinned, pressing his attack. But not good enough. The clearing filled with the ring of metal on metal as the two men danced their deadly dance. Magnus was faster, more fluid, his movements honed by regular practice and recent battles. But Jorund had advantages too: reach, strength, and something deeper, the quiet desperation of a man fighting not for glory or gold, but for the right to protect something precious. A feint high and strike low nearly caught Jorund off guard, Magnus's axe head whistling past his knee by inches. The younger man's face lit up with confidence as he saw his opponent's weakness, pressing forward with renewed aggression. "Getting tired already?" Magnus called out between strikes. "Perhaps you should yield now, while you still can." But even as the words left his mouth, something changed in Jorund's stance. The rust was falling away, 20 years of muscle memory reasserting itself like a dam finally breaking. His movements became smoother, more certain, and his dark eyes took on the cold focus that had once made him legendary among his warrior brothers. Magnus noticed the change and stepped up his attack, raining blows that would have felled a lesser man. But Jorund was no longer the uncertain hermit who had started this fight. He was becoming something else, something that had slept too long and was finally awakening. To the sound of clashing steel, their axes met in a series of thunderous impacts that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Magnus was skilled, but Jorund was remembering skills that went deeper than technique. The warrior's intuition that read an opponent's intentions in the flicker of an eye, the battle sense that turned desperate defense into devastating counterattack. When Jorund's axe finally found its mark, sliding past Magnus's guard to open a thin line across his forearm, the younger man staggered backward with shock and pain painted across his features. "First blood," Jorund said quietly, lowering his weapon. "The contest is decided." But Magnus was not finished. Blood dripping from his wounded arm, he raised his axe again with a snarl of rage and frustration. "No," he shouted. "I didn't come this far to lose to a broken-down hermit. The gold is mine by right." He lunged forward in a desperate attack, abandoning form for fury, his axe sweeping toward Jorund's neck in a killing blow that would have ended more than just the contest. Time seemed to slow as Jorund realized that his opponent had abandoned the rules of trial by combat. This was no longer a formal duel. This was a fight to the death. Magnus's killing blow whistled through the morning air with the sound of death itself, but it never found its target. Jorund moved with the fluid grace of his warrior prime, 20 years of rust falling away like snow before the spring sun. His massive frame pivoted on one heel, and his axe swept up in a defensive arc that caught Magnus's weapon and turned it aside with bone-jarring force. "You break faith with the old ways," Jorund said, his voice carrying the authority of mountains and winter storms. "Trial by combat demands honor. You have forfeited yours." Magnus stumbled backward, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Honor? What honor is there in losing everything to a madman who talks to ghosts?" But even as he spoke, he was preparing for another attack, his wounded arm streaming blood, but still gripping his weapon with deadly intent. The two younger men who had ridden with him exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with their leader's abandonment of the formal rules that governed such contests. "Magnus," one of them called out. "First blood has been drawn. The mountain won fairly." "Silence!" Magnus roared, never taking his pale eyes off Jorund. "I'll not be lectured by children about fairness." He launched himself forward again, this time with the desperate fury of a man who knew he was beaten but refused to accept defeat. His axe carved deadly patterns through the air, each swing powered by muscles driven beyond their limits by sheer force of will. But Jorund was no longer the uncertain hermit who had begun this fight. He was Jorund Eriksson, son of Eric Ironhand, inheritor of a warrior tradition that stretched back to the first longships. Every parry flowed into the next, every defensive move setting up potential counterattacks that he chose not to make. He was giving Magnus every opportunity to yield with dignity intact. "Enough," Jorund said, after deflecting yet another wild swing. "You're wounded and beaten. Accept defeat with grace and ride away with your life." "Never." Magnus snarled, but his movements were becoming increasingly desperate, his strength failing as blood loss took its toll. "The child's inheritance belongs to—" His words cut off in a gasp of pain as Jorund's axe handle, reversed and swung with precise control, caught him across the ribs with stunning force. Magnus doubled over, his weapon dropping from nerveless fingers as he struggled to breathe. Jorund stepped forward and placed the edge of his axe against Magnus's throat, not cutting, just resting there like a promise of what could be. "The child's inheritance belongs to her," Jorund said quietly, "and she will grow up free from men like you, who see gold where they should see wonder." Magnus looked up from his crouched position, his pale eyes filled with hatred and defeat in equal measure. "You think this ends it? You think the king will allow his royal cousin to be raised by a hermit in the wilderness?" "The king's decree was clear," Jorund replied. "Protection, not control. She'll be safer here than in any court, away from the scheming and plotting that killed her father." He stepped back, lowering his weapon but keeping his guard up. Magnus remained on his knees for a moment, then slowly, painfully pushed himself to his feet. His left arm hung useless at his side, dark blood staining his sleeve, but his eyes burned with undiminished hatred. "This isn't over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are others who have claims on that child. Others who won't be satisfied with empty hands. Then they can face the same choice you did," Jorund said evenly. "Combat or exile. Those are the only options I offer to men who would threaten children." Magnus retrieved his axe with his good hand, his movements careful and pained. His two companions moved to help him, but he waved them off with gruff pride. Even in defeat, he would not show weakness before witnesses. "We'll go," he said finally. "But mark my words, hermit, this child's blood will draw more than just family disputes. Royal bastards have a way of attracting trouble, no matter how deep in the wilderness they hide." The three men mounted their horses with difficulty, Magnus requiring assistance despite his attempts to manage alone. As they prepared to ride away, he turned back one final time, his pale eyes fixed on the longhouse where Ingrid stood holding her daughter. "The girl has a right to know her heritage," he called out. "When she comes of age, she'll learn what you've kept from her. What will she think of her hermit guardian then?" The words hit Jorund like physical blows, awakening doubts he'd been trying to suppress. What right did he have to make such choices for another person's child? What happened when little Astrid grew old enough to understand what she'd lost by staying in these mountains? But then, baby Astrid chose that moment to cry, a strong, healthy wail that spoke of life and possibility rather than loss and regret. The sound seemed to drive the shadows from Jorund's heart, reminding him that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for what might be, but for what was precious in the present moment. The three riders disappeared into the forest, their horses picking careful paths through the mud and debris left by the storm. Soon even the sound of their passage faded, leaving only the morning quiet of birds and wind through pine branches. Jorund stood in the center of the clearing for a long moment, his axe heavy in his hands, the weight of his new responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a cloak. When he finally turned toward the longhouse, he found Ingrid watching him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for choosing us." Looking down at the baby in her arms, his baby now in all the ways that mattered, Jorund felt something shift in his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his heart over 20 years of solitude were crumbling, making room for something he'd thought was dead forever: hope. 3 months later, as autumn painted the mountain valley in shades of gold and crimson, Jorund stood at his doorway, watching Ingrid tend the garden they had expanded together. Little Astrid lay in a cradle he had carved from pine wood, gurgling contentedly at the play of light and shadow through the overhead branches. The longhouse, that had echoed with solitude for 20 years, now rang with laughter, conversation, and the small sounds of daily life shared. The thunderstone still held its place on the mantel, but now it was joined by other treasures, a wooden rattle Jorund had carved for Astrid, dried flowers Ingrid had gathered from their walks, letters from the royal court acknowledging the child's placement under his protection. The old life and the new existed side by side, neither erasing the other but both enriched by the connection. "She's growing so fast," Ingrid observed, straightening from her work among the turnips and late carrots. The past months had filled out the hollow places in her cheeks, and her green eyes sparkled with a contentment that went deeper than mere survival. Soon she'll be sitting up on her own. Soon enough, she'll be running through these woods like a young deer, Jorund replied, settling onto the bench he'd built beside the door. "Getting into all manner of trouble." "Just like her guardian did, I imagine." Ingrid wiped her hands on her apron and joined him, lifting Astrid from her cradle. The baby had grown round and healthy on her mother's milk and the security of their mountain refuge. Her dark eyes were bright with intelligence, and she had already learned to recognize Jorund's voice, turning toward him with unmistakable delight whenever he spoke. "I was a model child," Jorund protested with mock seriousness. "Never gave my parents a moment's worry." "Of course not." Ingrid's laughter was warm as summer honey. "That's why they named you after thunder, for your quiet and gentle nature," as if summoned by her words. Real thunder rumbled in the distance, not the violent crash of storm weather, but the deep, contented growl of late-season rain moving through the valleys. The sound no longer filled Jorund with memories of loss and grief. Now it spoke of renewal, of life continuing its ancient cycles, of love that endured even when hearts thought they were broken beyond repair. A rider appeared on the mountain path, moving slowly and carefully through the fallen leaves. Jorund tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward the axe that now rested within easy reach, even during peaceful moments. But as the figure drew closer, he relaxed. The newcomer wore the blue and silver of the royal court, and his posture spoke of official business rather than threat. "Jorund Eriksson?" the messenger called as he approached. "I bear word from King Harald himself." The royal messenger dismounted and approached with the careful respect due to a man whose reputation had been burnished by recent events. Word of the trial by combat had spread through the kingdoms, carrying with it stories of the hermit who had taken royal blood under his protection. "What word does the king send?" Jorund asked, rising to his full imposing height. The messenger unrolled a parchment sealed with the royal arms. "His Majesty commends you for your protection of his young cousin. He recognizes your guardianship as lawful and just, and grants you full authority over the child's upbringing until she reaches her majority." And Jorund could sense there was more. "The king also extends an invitation for you and the child's mother to visit the court at your convenience. He wishes to meet the man who defeated Magnus Eriksson in single combat, and to see his young cousin thriving under your care." Ingrid shifted the baby to her shoulder, her expression thoughtful. "An invitation, not a command." "An invitation," the messenger confirmed, "though one that carries the king's personal interest and approval." Jorund considered the implications. A royal invitation was not something to be declined lightly, but neither was it something that required immediate response. "Tell His Majesty that we are honored by his interest. When the child is older and travel would not endanger her health, we will gladly accept his hospitality." The messenger bowed. "I will convey your words exactly." The king expected no less from the mountain, measured wisdom rather than hasty action. After the messenger had departed, carrying word back to the distant court, Jorund and Ingrid sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter discover the fascinating complexity of her own fingers. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details but rich with possibility. "Do you ever regret it?" Ingrid asked quietly. "Giving up your solitude for the complications we've brought into your life?" Jorund looked around at the life they had built together, the expanded garden, the baby clothes drying on a line he'd strung between two trees, The toys and tools and small domestic arrangements that spoke of permanence and hope. Then he looked at Astrid, who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her tiny face peaceful with the absolute trust of the well-loved. "Never," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. 20 years ago, I thought my life was over when I lost my first family. I built walls around my heart and convinced myself they were protection. But love isn't something you can wall away forever. It finds cracks, flows around barriers, grows back stronger than before. He reached out to touch the baby's soft hair, marveling at the delicate perfection of her sleeping form. Astrid, both Astrids, taught me that some things are worth fighting for, worth hoping for, worth opening your heart to despite the risk of loss. Ingrid leaned against his shoulder, and he felt the rightness of it. 3 people who had found each other in a storm, creating something stronger than any of them could have built alone. The thunderstone pulsed with warmth from its place inside the longhouse, and Jorund could almost hear his beloved wife's voice carried on the autumn wind. "Love endures, my dear one. It always endures." As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jorund Eriksson, hermit no longer, held his chosen family close and looked toward a future bright with promise. Sometimes, he reflected, the storms that seem most destructive are actually carrying exactly what we need to rebuild our lives. Sometimes the people we fear most are indeed the ones who hold our salvation, and sometimes, in the quiet moments after the thunder passes, we discover that our hearts are far stronger and more resilient than we ever dared to believe.